Good morning, Inspector. Just to confirm that the session is now live on YouTube.
Right. Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Yes. All right. Thank you. So the inquiry is resumed. Just to remind people about electronic devices that I actually neglected to take on board was to make sure they're either silent or switched off. And also to say about the procedure, which everyone seems to be following quite well, is that if you're not taking part in the proceedings, just make sure your camera's switched off and also you're on mute. The two main advocates aren't going to have their cameras switched off. But if you do need to make a point, like I say, you shouldn't be really interrupting anything, as these are formal proceedings. Just raise your hand and I will try and take that on board at the appropriate time. But anyway, what we did yesterday, we left it with Mr. Howell Williams cross-examining Mr. Smith, and he hasn't completed that, so we will be completing that. But however, I have suggested to Ms. Sean Lazelle that she could give evidence today. Now, is Ms. Sean Lazelle here at the moment on the... Is there any sign of her here?
Yes, I'm here.
You are here. Right.
Yeah.
You said, are you able to be available a bit longer? Because I'd prefer to try and finish the evidence of Mr. Howell Williams, a cross-examination, and any re-examination, any questions I've got of Mr. Smith before I hear your evidence, rather than have a break. So are you available for a bit longer?
How much longer would it be, Inspector, that you'd require me to?
Well, it might be another hour.
Okay. I'm a business editor, so I work to quite tight deadlines. I could rejoin the meeting in an hour if you like, or
I think that's going to be best, because I'd prefer to just hear the evidence straight through from Mr. Smith. So if you can rejoin a bit later, say in an hour's time, I'm hoping. Oh well, I'm not totally sure, but I'm hoping that we might well have heard the evidence. At least we should be near the end of hearing the evidence by then. So I'll then hear your statement, which I'd just like to say that I have received a statement from you, a written statement. So thank you very much for providing that. Hopefully it's been provided to the appellant and counsel as well. But so you'll be in a position to read that one out. So what I'll do then, is there anything else that anyone else would like to raise before I move on to Mr. White? So.
Yes, so very briefly, in the light of, it would be the appellant's strong desire, in the light of the uncertainty or Mr. Myatt's unavailability, could we do the sports roundtable when we finish with Mr. Smith, and having after heard from Ms. Lazelle, just because that guarantees that we would complete that before Mr. Myatt's problems with availability take place? Because I'm just concerned if we didn't do that, there must be a bit of uncertainty. I put it no higher than that, whether we can do the public rights of way and the sports roundtable if we don't get onto them till 11 o'clock.
Yeah. Can I put that to Mr. Howell Williams, whether that would be acceptable? I can see some benefits in that the sports one may, well, I'm anticipating the sports one to take longer than the public right of way discussion, because the public right of way discussion is some of it might even be legal submissions, but I don't know. But the public right of way discussion seems to be more to do with one public right of way that needs to be confirmed, and it seems to be all around that. whereas the sports one seems to be a bit more complex in terms of the issues involved. But Mr. Howell Williams, have you got anything to say on that proposal?
I've asked for instructions on that. My suggestion is that we start and try and finish Mr. Smith as soon as possible.
Yes, that's what I'm happy to do.
Yes. I mean, the only difficulty with Mr. White's suggestion is that we then make it an imperative, it seems to me, to be trying to finish by 2 o'clock, which is quite a, I'm not sure how likely that's going to be, but I think the best thing, sir, is to crack on and just review it when we've the cross-examination.
Yes, because really, in some ways, Mr. Mayett is available all day, isn't he? So we could feasibly carry on a bit later if we really wanted to, but
well, sir, I've got a bit. Mr. Grady, it's come to my attention. Mr. Grady has an issue of he's got quite an important doctor's appointment at 3 o'clock, so I just put that into the balance. And so everything I accused Mr. Howell Williams of last night is just as relevant to be accused to me.
It doesn't make life easy.
No, I completely agree with that. I completely see that, sir. But all right, should we just reflect on it as Mr. Howell Williams makes? Let's deal with Mr. Smith and as time, let's deal with Mr. Smith, and then we'll come back to it.
Yeah, I think we ought to. So I'll carry on with Mr. Howell. I might have some questions of Mr. Smith myself as well. So, but anyway, we'll deal with Mr. Smith. So in that case, I'll hand over to Mr. Howell Williams and Mr. Smith to resume the cross-examination that was started yesterday. Thank you.
Morning, sir.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Smith.
Good morning, Mr. Howell Williams.
With your help, I'd like to get through the remainder of my questions, at least within the hour, and I'd be targeting 30 minutes with your help. Okay.
I will certainly try.
And where, of course, matters of judgment are involved, we've got to remember, 1, try not to repeat ourselves. That's for you and for me. And 2, remember that the inspector is going to carry out a visit to the site, which will, of course, inform him and his judgment. So with that in mind, can I just ask you 1 or 2 questions in relation to the scheme and its design? You have said in your proof of evidence that you use the phrase, there's been a dramatic reduction in the number of the units comparing the previous scheme with the current scheme.
Yes.
And it is true that there has been a reduction in the number of units from 250 to 241.
141, sorry.
141, yeah, quite right. Could you look, please, to the DAS, the Design and Access Statement, CD 1.2.
Bear with me.
Yeah.
Part 1, 2 or 3?
Section 3.1.
Okay, I'll have a guess at part 1.
Page 35, does that help?
Not really, if I'm honest. Let me just try this and see how far it goes.
Yeah, sure. I've only got one sort of bundle in hard copy of the DAS, but maybe I'm missing something.
Part 1 goes up to 29. So by a process of deduction, I have part 2. Yeah. So sorry, page.
Page 35.
Yes, I have that.
Great. And so do you have that, section 3.1?
Yes, I have got that. Yes, it is. Yes, I realise it was in, because I'm on the electronic version and it is in two well, it's 3 parts and it is part 2. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Smith. And we see that on the left-hand side, there's a picture of the previous scheme, and on the right-hand side, there's a picture of the current scheme.
Yes.
We can see from a comparison of those 2 drawings that in essence, the residential development area has not changed significantly, has it? I think the figures are given in this document, but the appeal scheme, I think we see is 5.25 hectares for the developable area.
That's about right, I think, yes.
And the previous scheme, I have a reference deep in the documentation to 5.41 hectares. Does that sound familiar and correct?
Again, that probably sounds about right, I think, yes.
And remembering the figure of 78% yesterday, do you remember that figure for open space, having regard to the whole site? Our equivalent figure that we've calculated, perhaps you can agree, it doesn't matter if it's not precise, but about 73 versus 78%. Would you agree?
That sounds about correct again, I think, yes.
So whilst the quantum in terms of the number of units has reduced by approximately 40%, the benefit in terms of open space is about, well, it's less than 5%, isn't it?
Seen in gross figures, yes. Obviously, it's about where that space has been apportioned.
Yeah. And the other thing just to bear in mind, and again, I don't really know why this is the case. On the last scheme, the illustrative layout, I think showed 241 units rather than 250. And on this scheme, the illustrative master plan, I'm assuming showing the appellants, as it were, best case at the moment, shows 141 units, doesn't it?
It does.
So we've not actually got a layout which illustrates the scheme as intended to be permitted and governed by the planning permission sought by the appellant.
Well, as you know, the western side of the site is in outline, so it's illustrative at the moment.
Yeah, forgive me, but we're not putting. You're not thinking of putting residential units on the east side, are you?
Of course. No.
So the outline is referable to the west side, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. But we haven't got a scheme which shows the layout with the maximum number of units on the western side of the footpath.
Not in that plan, no.
No.
So can I just interrupt? Because this is what's being put forward as the master plan for the appeal, this appeal. So that means that there's no actual master plan available at the moment that shows the full amount that this appeal is trying to put on that site. Is that the case?
I think maybe there'd be a clarification that Mr. Ross can make. In fact, I think one of the confusions here, sir, is that from recollection, I think the plan in the appendix to Mr. Ross's proof, which seeks to try and accommodate proposed AB 70, I think that may have 141 units. I have a feeling that this one in the DAS does show 145 units. So sorry for that lack of clarity, sir, but that's something that maybe someone in my team can clarify for me. That is my recollection.
I'd like it clarified, because although this is the DAS, the actual scheme proposals are put on the plans that's been agreed, and I want to know whether those plans or any plan that is going to be put forward at this appeal actually shows a scheme that's got the full 145 units on.
As I say, so
But Mr. Ross
I'm sorry, sir.
Mr. Ross might be able to answer that then, or someone else. I don't know.
I think Mr. Ross would be the best person, but certainly my feeling, sir, is that this is, as in the DAS and as shown in my appendices to the LBA, is 145 homes, and the plan appended to Mr. Ross's proof is 141.
Right. I think that needs clarifying, because it's important to know how many units are actually shown on the master plan.
Yeah, understood, sir.
And the illustrative master plan is the one we're using at this appeal to determine the feasibility and acceptability of this development, isn't it?
Yeah, understood.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Howell Williams. I just wanted to clarify that myself, really.
Well,
Yeah.
quite so. And for the same reason, I sought clarification. But I think the position is, Mr. Smith will confirm, that whilst he's not sure, he believes that the illustrative master plan, which we have been referring to so far, contains 250 units. And he believes that the LVIA was carried out and assessed on that basis.
145, Mr. Howell Williams.
145, I beg your pardon, Mr. Smith, yeah, not 141.
Correct. And then, yeah.
Okay. Fine. I, for one, had thought that that wasn't the case. I thought that the illustrative master plan was put forward with 241. 141.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought that that figure was new in relation to the plan showing AB 70. Okay, but we'll bear that in mind in a moment when we come to that plan.
Can we just clarify that with the appellant? It's anyway, I think that needs clarification, because it seems to me that Mr. Smith's not totally sure. Is that the case, Mr. Smith?
My belief is that the plan shows 145, but I seek clarification from my team on that.
Yeah, because there has been, I think the plans that Mr. Ross submitted showing the diversion of the footpath, or this is to do with AB 70, showed 141. I think that's been stated that was 141.
Correct.
But I haven't got anything to say that that is any different from what the original master plan, or the one that's been put in for this appeal, shows. So I do need some clarification on that. Thank you. Thanks. So I'll hand back to Mr. Howell Williams. Yeah.
Okay. It doesn't seem as if we're getting clarification from the appellant right now. I would have thought it's a matter of fact, but I'm just pausing in case anybody can help.
Mr. White, are you in a position to help or not?
Well, I do. I'm just getting instructions, and I don't want to blurt out something that then needs remedying.
Oh, no.
Correct. So I will absolutely confirm. Unless Mr. Howell Williams tells me it affects his cross-examination, I will give the definitive picture at the end of the cross-examination. But if he wants definitive view, I will get the architect to confirm now, and we'll break.
Well, sorry, Mr. Howell Williams, is this important to your cross-examination at the present time? Yeah, you're on. Yeah.
I don't want to delay matters, and
No.
I'd rather continue. It's a point of fact that can be clarified, and insofar as any comments need to be made thereafter, they can be made. So I'm quite happy to carry on if Mr. Smith is.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And can I just ask you then some questions about impacts, Mr. Smith, against the background that this is really a matter for judgment for the inspector. He's got a lot of evidence already, and he'll be carrying out his site view very carefully. In your proof of evidence, you refer to the fact that currently along the footpath of AB 12, there are, I think you call them frequent or often views, not only to the east, but to the west, with views to what you called yesterday the largely rural pastoral landscape. Okay?
Yeah, largely, mostly rural, yeah.
That's not, yeah, largely rural pastoral landscape. And what your new scheme has achieved is 3 vistas, is that correct? Which retain a view of the church.
Yes, at present there are glimpsed oblique views. So as you walk down that path, obviously you don't get views towards St Mildred's all the way down AB12. You get glimpses, sometimes between shrubs and trees. And obviously what we've sought to do is where those views are particularly strong, we've retained those views by creating vistas.
Yeah, but the one is those glimpses are frequent. We can agree that. They're part of the experience of walking down the footpath. Yes?
I don't know if I'd say frequent, frankly. I've found that they're in 3 main areas down that path. Some of them are longer sequences of views than others. Some of them are very much glimpses. If we're still looking at the DAS here, for example, and you see those 3 arrows, the top one there is very much a glimpsed view, which the inspector will see. But the bottom 2, there are some views in between those 2 arrows. So, but parts in between those don't necessarily have clear views at all.
Yeah, it's not quite the way I was putting it. I was only thinking of what you've said in your evidence so far, that there are often views towards the church from the footpath. It may be that I thought that would be agreed, that there are those often, not at every point, but often, frequently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to provide clarity for the inspector about the nature of those views.
Yeah, sure, but as long as we can agree, consistent with your written proof, that they are often or frequent, then I'm happy to move on. But I don't want you to I need to make a comment if you're now saying something different.
Often is fine with my qualification.
Okay. Now those views, other than the 3 vistas that you have retained, will be removed.
Some of those views, yes, would be screened by development. However, obviously we're providing a lot more access to areas which currently don't have any formal access, and therefore there will be new views of St Mildred's that would be provided, for example, along greenways.
When you say some of those frequent views, other than the 3 that you've created vistas for, will be removed, it's true, isn't it, consistent with your evidence in LVIA, that all of those glimpses will be lost. The 3 remaining views are those as you've identified in the LVIA.
Well, for clarity, as I've just tried to describe by using those arrows on the DAS image there are a number of concentrations of views. And as I've said, between the middle arrow and the southernmost arrow, a lot of those views from AB12 would be lost. But indeed, some of the, but then obviously we're retaining those 3 key vistas.
Okay, well, we've got, the appellant has produced no sort of wireframes to demonstrate any of the glimpses that would be retained. And it's certainly Mr. Withercomb's view that those views, other than the 3 vistas, will be lost. Okay, you say not quite true, but a lot of them will be lost. Is that the difference between us, that the inspector has to?
Forgive me, can I just, without waiting any inquiry time, I mean, what I've said earlier on is I've said we're going to create new views as well, but we are going to lose, outside of those 3 vistas, I would say most of the views outside of those 3 vistas from AB12 would be lost. I'm prepared to say that. That is factually correct.
Okay. Well, there is a small difference between you and Mr. Withercombe on that. But on that basis, leaving that matter for the inspector to make a judgment, can I ask you to look to the master plan just for a moment, okay, just to give the inspector a feel here. I'm looking at revision 1. I think and hope that's the correct one, Mr. Smith.
Okay, well, I'm looking at T4 in my LVA, which I think is pretty much the same.
Okay. I think they're the same though, aren't they?
I think so, yeah.
If you are walking down the footpath from Woodchurch Road to Appledore Road, views to the east will be there to be enjoyed. Mr. Smith, correct?
Correct.
And then when we get to a position where we're level with the development, that's where the glimpses, frequent glimpses, will either be wholly lost or mostly lost, other than the vistas that you've created by the layout.
Yes, some of those views will be lost because there's obviously a hedge there at the moment, as you can see from the plan, and the inspector will see on site. So the views are not always clear, but there are some glimpsed views. And yes, those glimpses would be screened and or filtered by proposed development.
And at viewpoint 5, which I don't think we need to open up, but the inspector will have that in mind and can open it up if he wishes. That's the first vista coming southbound, Mr. Smith.
Well, no, there's the vista at viewpoint. Oh, sorry, it is 5. You're absolutely right. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. The LVIA describes the experience coming down this footpath with the proposal in place at paragraph 5.5.1. And if you take that to hand, it's a useful overall assessment of the visual effects.
Yes.
And what it says is the proposed development would result in sequential, major, moderate, and negative effects for walkers on footpath AB12, since views to the west will include very noticeable new homes in the fore and middle ground. And then you say, however, it's also important to acknowledge viewpoints 5B and 9, which would attract views along greenways towards the focal point of St. Mildred's. Okay?
Yes.
Now, so far as sequential, major, moderate, and negative effects are concerned, the experience here of the footpath will be transformational, won't it, in terms of the loss of the rural pastoral views to the west?
It will be a big change in those views, which is why I've obviously arrived at major, moderate visual effects.
Yeah. And when we get to the vista, okay, and by all means have that photo montage to hand, we can see that there are indeed very noticeable new homes in the fore and middle ground, can't we?
Yes, sir, that's drawing T18 at the back of the LVA.
Thanks, Mr. Smith, thanks. He's pausing there, and the inspector need only nod if he's got there.
He's now trying to find the drawing number on the bottom of an A1 sheet.
I know they're not easy to pick up. I can tell you. That.
Yeah, I've got T18. Yes.
Oh, I'm grateful. And this is what is meant in the LVIA by the very noticeable new homes. And it's fair to say, isn't it, that whilst the church is visible in the view, the impact of the houses is such, very noticeable as they are, that the houses are the dominant feature in the view.
That's a really good question, and if I may, I don't entirely agree. Is my answer, briefly, I would suggest that St Mildred's remains the focal point of the view. I think that the tree line, and obviously people are drawn to the skyline in views. I think the fact that you see St Mildred's over the canopies of trees is key. So I think that, and the fact that we have created a greenway that points to that feature really accentuates the importance of it. But I'm certainly not denying, and obviously the LVA doesn't deny the visibility of the proposed houses. So I'm not suggesting that they're not visible in the view, they very much are. It's just that they're clearly, the whole development is pointing towards St Mildred. So I think that sense of that distinctive element remains.
But in terms of the experience, well, I think possibly we should leave it there, Mr. Smith. You said my question was a really good one, whether or not the built development was now the dominant feature in the view, and you said, well, you couldn't entirely agree.
I can't agree with that because I feel that the focal point remains, but what I'm acknowledging is that, of course, these new buildings are clearly visible. Okay, that's fine. And at this point, of course, the illustrative master plan shows a play area, doesn't it? Which will be even closer to the footpath. Just bear with me a second, going back to the plan. Yeah, it's not quite in the same location.
It's, well, it would be, sorry, you carry on, Mr. Smith.
It's not in the same location, it will be to the right of the view. I can promise you we've absolutely modelled the play areas into the montages, and it actually occurred to the right of the view. I think you can actually, potentially you can see it at the right, but it's not in the centre of that vista, because obviously we've made a point of making sure that the foreground of that vista remains clear.
Well, we'll leave that to the inspector to make a judgment. Certainly it was my view that the playground would be part of the experience at that point, to the right of the view perhaps, but nonetheless influencing the perspective for walkers.
No, I promise you that we have intentionally designed it to one side of the vista.
And the distance to the homes at that point, and we can look again at the master plan, and the master plan was given in, perhaps the inspector can stop at the point, and see whether or not he's going to have an appreciation of the playground. But the homes are, well, 40, 50 or so meters from the footpath, aren't they? Is that right?
About 50.
Yeah, okay, thank you, it's very helpful. And then we walk further south, and the houses, well, there's a house within 30 meters of the footpath, is that right? Just to the south of viewpoint 5.
The closest one I can see. Oh, if you gone next to the sports pitches, are you there now?
No, I'm not there yet. No, I'm just to the south of the vista.
Okay.
And I can see, and I've measured it off with my scale on your plan, and it's 30 meters.
I get that 40.
Right. Well, we'll leave that there for the inspector to see, but I'm using my scale rule, and it's, well, yeah, 30, shall we say no more than 40?
Okay.
Okay. And then the walker will perambulate further south to viewpoint B,
Yes.
the vista B. And again, we've lost most of the glimpses in that short walk. But then there's a vista, and the same points arise, do they not, that there will be very noticeable houses, and the inspector can make a judgment again about the dominant feature in the view and the perspective and experience gained at that point.
May I just say, the glimpses you talk about between viewpoint 5 and viewpoint B are far more limited because there's quite strong vegetation in the central part of AB12, and you can see it on the plan next to the existing pond. So there are very few views in that location. So when you then emerge from that vegetation, that's when you then, at the moment, you get a vista towards St Mildred's at that point. So we've retained that vista.
So the very few glimpses there, valuable as they are, of the rural pastoral landscape to the west will be gone.
Well, yes, as I say, there are very few, and where they are available, yes, they would be screened by the development, yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And at viewpoint B, to the left of the vista, again, I won't, you know, the inspector's got my very good question there about what is the dominant feature in the view, but the nearest house there is about 10 meters from the footpath.
Yeah, our scale rules are slightly different, I think. I've got it at about 15 meters, but you're not far apart.
Not far apart, okay. 10 to 15 meters, okay. And plainly, I would suggest the inspector should obviously reach the view that not only are those houses very noticeable, but because they're very noticeable, they will be the dominant feature in the experience for the walker.
This is T56, sir, which I referred to in chief. So at the back of my LVA again. And
yeah.
Thank you. I would say in this view, yes, I think the houses are more prominent than they were in viewpoint 5. Clearly, if you look at the proportion of the view that is occupied by green space, it's the majority of the view. So I'm not denying for a moment that the houses are not visible, they are, but I'm saying that there's also a very prominent green space. Clearly, it has new habitats. You can see St Mildred's again on the skyline. And I think this is where I made the point, and I don't want to go through this again. I made the point about good design, because this is a good surveyed space here. But I will leave that there. I've said that.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And then the walker continues to the south, and the houses continue to be between, well, up to say 10 to 20 meters to the footpath, don't they, if one looks to the west?
Yes, they do. There's obviously we've put a line of scrub along that side there. So there's a suggestion that we might produce some screening of that area.
Right. Okay, so we'll have some screening there. But at viewpoint 9, and that's again shown in a very montage, the inspector will have to make a judgment about the impacts there compared with the existing. And
that's T28, sir.
Yes, it is. And again, the inspector will have to consider the very good question about what is prominent in the view. But, sorry, Mr. Smith.
No, you ask your question first, please.
But at this point, the inspector will also have to bear in mind that if the walker turns to look to the east, he will have a substantial building, the pavilion building, less than its major part being less than 10 meters from the footpath. Correct as a matter of fact, I think.
Factually, that's correct. And obviously we've placed a hedgerow along that edge to try and filter views towards that building. It's meant to be an attractive building as shown in the DAS. It's a single story building, but yes, it is very close to the footpath there, you're right.
And it's very, very close, but the building is 2 eaves. Again, my scale rule may be wrong, but I think it's marked on one of the plans. It's 7 meters, isn't it?
That sounds correct, yes.
And that's going to be 7 meters within a distance of, well, certainly less than between 10 and 15 meters.
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, yes, again, we have to be careful about, I mean, obviously I've assessed this as a major moderate visual effect.
Yeah.
For this very reason. I still feel there's a second judgment then that needs to be made about design quality, and that building has design quality.
Okay, good. Well, that's really helpful. Thanks, Mr. Smith. And then could I ask you to turn to Mr. Ross's Appendix G to look at the plans relating to proposed footpath AB70.
Yes, I have that actually, I think. Yeah. Yes, I have that.
I don't want to trespass too much into the next session this morning, but and certainly I don't want to get bogged down in arguments about the relevance of this. That's for another occasion. But in your proof of evidence, you said that there is ample space to accommodate footpath AB70.
Yes.
Yeah. And this is the plan that attempts to show that.
Yes.
Yeah. And we can see that looking at 0002 and looking from point D, do you see that, Mr. Smith? Do you have point D?
I see that, yeah.
And one starts the footpath walk to the west. Within a very short space of time, the walker, instead of the rural pastoral landscape to enjoy at the moment, albeit with the influence you've drawn attention to, and I don't want to start that argument again, from the settlement edge, but is going to be, well, it can't be described surely as very close houses. This footpath is going to be cheek by jowl with built development.
There are places, without a doubt, where it will be close to houses. I don't see that as a negative. I think there's a varied experience along that path. It provides some very attractive views along greenways, and obviously it also goes through the country park. So, but I don't deny it's a matter of fact. There are places where it comes close to houses, just as footpaths do on, for example, Tenterden and Tilden Gill.
Right. So have I got this right, that your judgment about the amenity of this footpath is that, yes, it's going to be close or very close to houses, but you don't see that as a negative impact on the amenity of the footpath?
I have said in my assessment that there would be some negative effects, because again, I have to, as I said yesterday, I have to assess built form in a green field as a negative effect. So I have to assess from a visual point of view that those would cause negative effects.
Sure.
But from a design point of view, I'm saying that makes that footpath surveyed, safe, and there would be a positive experience with good views.
Right. So I just want to focus on the landscape and visual impact assessment. If you were to be carrying out your LVIA on this footpath, which has not been done, but it is a pretty obvious conclusion, isn't it, that the impacts shown would be far in excess of those, even those to which you've drawn attention to as substantial and moderate.
If AB 70 existed, then yes, there would be significant visual effects. Obviously, it doesn't. But yes, there would, in pure visual assessment terms, yes, there would be at least moderate major visual effects.
And just so I'm absolutely clear, Mr. Smith, from my note, you mean negative?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith, and with your help, we've done reasonably well.
Thank you, Mr. Howell-Williams.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify on, I may have missed this or something, but in terms of the 250 dwelling development that was refused, were you involved in that one, Mr. Smith?
No.
You weren't involved at all?
No.
No. But so your LVA, you did the LVA based on the 145
Yes.
dwellings, right?
Yes.
And in terms of that, you've said that you helped to design or make modifications to the 250 dwelling proposal to try and improve it.
Yes, I did.
So in other words, would you have, do you agree with the fact that the 250 dwelling development should have been refused? Do you agree with those, with that basis? Because you said you've improved that to try and make sure it's acceptable. So would you basically say that the 250 dwelling proposal was unacceptable and the council were correct to refuse it, albeit other factors, but to refuse it on the grounds of the landscape character and appearance grounds?
The simple answer is I felt that scheme was too dense. The densities in the parcels, I think, caused all sorts of issues in terms of conflict with the surrounding landscape. I also felt that 250 house scheme didn't provide sufficient buffering along some of the greenways and to some of the properties around the site, and indeed to AB 12. So although, as Mr. Howell-Williams, as a matter of fact, is absolutely correct in pointing out the total quantum of POS hasn't massively increased, we did roll back development from AB 12. We have increased the size of the greenways. And one of the big elements that I was very clear about was that I wanted to see these vistas from AB 12, and they were not possible in the 250 home scheme. So whilst it may look similar on the face of it, if you look at the development parcels, you will notice that there are greenways and vistas through the parcels which allow those views. So, fundamentally, we wanted to retain all of the good things in terms of the sports facilities, the country park, and we wanted to incorporate these additional features. So my feeling, sir, about the 250 home scheme was I couldn't support it for those reasons.
Right.
But I felt the site had capacity for development, residential development.
Right. So you've acted as an advisor, and this is how. So what you've come up with is what based on your advice, is it? What the appellants come up with is based on your advice?
My advice, heritage advice, ecology advice,
Yeah.
but principally those three.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Like I say, I'll be able to go and visit the site anyway, so I'll be able to see some of these for myself. I know that the photo montages and photographs are quite helpful, but I think it's more helpful to actually see it myself. But yeah, thank you very much. I'll now ask whether Mr. White has got any follow-up questions following the cross-examination, Mr. White.
Yes, thank you, sir. Can I just be, I will be probably about 10, 15 minutes. I've got 7 matters, Mr. Smith, that I want to ask you about. Can I just ask you, the first one is in relation to the inspector's questions and the evidence you just gave in relation to your comments on the 250 scheme. In the light of those comments, to what extent, if any, did those comments inform the approach that you took when evolving the current scheme that lies before the inspector?
They are the bones of the scheme. That is why it is now acceptable to me. That is why, that's why I'm here, because I think that we've dealt with all of those issues. It's now a design that works, that respects its setting, and provides a very good setting to the settlement.
Thank you. Next point, Mr. Al Williams, towards the end of his question, asked you about the effect, the conclusion that you'd reach if you had assessed AB 70, if AB 70 had been in existence and a recognised public right of way, and you readily accepted it would probably have an impact of major moderate. Do you recall that evidence?
I do.
Now, I just want to ask you, can I take you down the same route of hypotheticals? And if you were asked to do an assessment in relation to Tent 1, we looked at your examination in chief and Tent 1's relationship to AB 31 and AB 32. Can I just ask you to tell the inspector what conclusion do you think you would have concluded if you'd asked to carry out a comparative assessment of the impact of Tent 1, which we can see on the ground in relation to the footpaths there? What would be in your judgment, do you think?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt they are at the least of medium-high sensitivity. Walkers are of medium-high sensitivity on that footpath. There is no doubt that they would have sequential, substantial effects. And they would be negative, of course, because you're seeing houses in a greenfield site. So the visual effects for users of that footpath would be major, moderate, and negative.
Well, can we just go to your plates 8, please, which is on page 64 of your evidence?
Yes, I have that.
And effectively, is that view, is that orientated effectively in a northerly direction?
Yes.
Now, I just want to ask you also, Mr. Hal Williams asked you about the effects. There was a passage of the cross-examination that dealt with the effects and the views on St Mildred's. Do you recall?
Yes.
And I just want to ask you in the specific context, and just let me get my notes so I'm absolutely fair. Yeah, the proposition was put to you that on some of those views on the proposal, the houses will be dominant in the view. Do you recall that?
I do. I disagreed with that, yes.
Yes, but I just want to ask you again, in relation to plate 8 and that viewpoint, is it your judgment that the houses are dominant in that view or are not? That actually St Mildred's has, I mean, what just applying the same kind of criteria, what would be your judgment in relation to that comparative view of the effect of a development with St Mildred's in the background?
At the moment, I would say you still have a focal point of the tree line and St Mildred's. So at the moment, I would still say that remains the focal point of the view, although again, the houses are very clearly visible. So it's similar in some ways to the description we had of viewpoint 5 in that regard. Obviously, given that the foreground is Tent 1B, that view could be lost.
Thank you. Now, next point, do you remember you had a passage yesterday afternoon where my learned friend asked you about the positive elements of the site currently, positive contribution that the site made currently?
Yes.
Could you please take up the proposed master plan, which is in your LVA? And I think from
T4.
exactly T4. And just to get the perspective, obviously you gave evidence on the contribution of the site currently. I just want to ask you, once the development is implemented, is it your judgment that the proposal would in future have elements or an element of positive contribution or not post the implementation of this scheme in terms of its effect on landscape character?
Well, I made the difference, if you recall, about LVA conclusions, which have to conclude some negative localized effects in landscape and visual terms. And I then differentiated the design benefits of the approach we're taking. And I talked about the radiating greenways, the large open spaces, the country park, and how that works in terms of the design of the settlement edge. It's a permeable, attractive, safe settlement edge with a lot of recreational opportunities and new habitats. So there is a difference, if you like. The landscape and visual tells us that there would be negative landscape and visual effects, but the design tells us that this is a high quality design which absolutely works in this location.
Thank you. Now, the final matter I want to ask you about is the 1989 appeal decision. So could you please take that up, which is CD 6.1b?
Bear with me. Yes, I have that.
Now, just I'm sure the inspectors picked up the context. There was 6.1a is the appeal decision from the 28th of July 1988. And we note the reference you made in examination in chief was to para 9, where the inspector concluded that the effect of the development would not seriously harm the overall character and appearance of the area.
Yes.
We then know that decision letter was subject to being quashed. We think it was by consent. We're not certain, but by consent order, because there doesn't seem to be any transcript or judgment that's available. But then we note the further appeal decisions, the 2nd of October 1989.
Yes.
And we just note, well, I just want to know to what extent, I just want to ask you about to what extent the conclusions there are still valid or not. And the first point I want to ask you about is in relation to para 2. We note in para 2 that actually the site under consideration there was 4.47 hectares.
Yes.
Is that, in your judgment, a comparative site area to the proposal that now sits before this inquiry?
Comparative in terms of development area, we're not far off that, but obviously we are providing a lot of additional space. Clearly 24 hectares is the size of our site, and our development is over the 12 hectares to the west. And obviously only 22% of our site would be development. So very different metrics.
Thank you. Then could I ask you please to go over the page to para 6, please?
Yes, I have that.
And let's just look at the policy context. What is it? We know, I don't want to make Mr. Howell Williams and I sentimental for the structure plans, but we note the Kent structure plan was in existence in para 6. And we note what happened is that SB2 says that basically there's a general presumption against further development of fresh land outside the existing confines of the built-up areas. And then we see a similar presumption is applied by policy SB4 outside the 18 urban areas. And of course, the 18 urban areas apply to the whole of Kent. Before we suddenly think there are 18 urban areas just in Ashford, because that's the structure plan. Then we note that in policy RS1, Tenterden is recognised as a small rural town where development outside the confines of the settlement would not be permitted unless the site has been identified for this purpose in a local plan, or in the absence of a local plan, there is a special local justification. And then we note the final paragraph in paragraph 6, the appeal site lies clearly outside the existing built confines of Tenterden, and as such the proposed development would, in my view, conflict directly with the policies of the approved structure plan.
Yes.
You see that? Now, I'm not going to ask you about those policies. I'll save that for Mr. Ross. But what I do want to ask you about is in para 7, just to set the context, we know RS3 enables local planning authorities to identify villages and small rural towns to be treated as exceptions. The council has made it quite clear through its local plan that Tenterden is primarily regarded as an RS3B settlement, where the primary planning policy towards new residential development will be conservation and enhancement of the town's special character. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now that sets the context. In para 10, I have concluded there are strong objections deriving from structure and local plan policies to the proposed development of the appeal site. However, I accept the conflict with planning policies alone is not a sufficient ground for refusal unless there's evidence that your client's development would give rise to demonstrable harm on the ground to the character and appearance of Tenterden. I turn now to this aspect. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, para 11, obviously you refer to this letter, as we remember in the good old days, was referred to old G.L. Hearn and the delightful Bob Selwood, who was the planning consultant for G.L. Hearn. No doubt Mr. Howell Williams worked with him. I certainly did. And we note that what's said by the appellants to justify their case is that site is bounded by housing on 2 of its 3 sites. Views into it are limited by topography and frontage development, that the development would not have the appearance of an intrusion into open countryside, and the development would be kept below the important ridgeline to the east. The last point is not disputed. And then we see a characterizations of the council's case. And then I just want to go to the conclusion in para 13. Although there would remain either 1 or 2 fields separating the footpath from the site, I consider that the housing development, which would be of a relatively intense nature, would appear as a substantial intrusion into the views of Tenterden and the conservation area.
Yes.
Now, from your understanding of the council's case at this inquiry, is there a concern to the conservation area or not as a reason of refusal?
No, there is not.
Thank you. Then para 14, we note it has been suggested proposed that housing would merely round off. This is an assessment which I cannot agree. Tenterden has a largely linear form, and it appears to me that a significant element in its character derives from the close proximity of the countryside to the heart of the town. Now, we know you made the comment in examination chief, you made a judgment about whether it be linear or not. I just want to ask, in your judgment, as a result of Tent 1 and also Tilden Gill and other developments since 1989, what is your judgment about whether that conclusion of the inspector in 1989 is valid or not in context of 2022?
Well, that was the point I was trying to make in cross-examination yesterday. I think that the form of the settlement has clearly continued to fill out and become less linear over time. And those 2 developments, again, move further from the linear historic development areas of the settlement. So the settlement is clearly becoming less linear.
Thank you. Now, could I also ask you, just finally on this point, could you take up CD 6.8, please? Which is an appeal decision that you appeared in Oakley last summer, and this is a decision letter of the 11th of August 2021.
Yes, I have that, yeah.
Now, I don't want to trouble you about the site specifics of that site, but what I just do want to know, which is comparative, in para 12, you will note that the inspector identifies that part of the site and the adjacent housing was part of the land from a 1988 appeal decision.
Yes, I remember, yeah.
And do you remember, did the 1988 appeal decision grant consent or refuse consent?
Refused.
And then just see what note the inspector's conclusions in para 27. And we notice, I don't want to deal with the site specifics of that site, but just look at the penultimate sentence of para 27, when the inspector's considering the case in 1988. Moreover, the policy context has altered and the landscape protection policies mentioned by the inspector do not exist today. Therefore, that I am content from the 1988 decision does not preclude the development in terms of the character and appearance of the area.
Yes.
I just want to ask your judgment. If the inspector, in the light of what we looked at, the landscape policies applying to this site in 1988 and what's said in the structure plan and what is now the position, what's your judgment about the comparative policy position in landscape policies between 1988, 89 and 2022?
I think it's a very different context. Clearly, there's still policies, as we've discussed in cross-examination, to conserve and enhance, but there's a very different set of policies now around judgments on landscape and visual bases.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. That's my re-examination. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Smith. So that's you're at the end of your evidence on this particular landscape issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
What I'll do next is I'll ask whether, yes, I can see that Shan Lazelle is available. So what I'll do is I'll ask Shan Lazelle to provide her statement. So if you can actually come forward on the screen and if you can unmute as well, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for making your time available now and also for providing the written statement. So I'm not saying you will be, I think it's unlikely you'll be asked any questions. It doesn't mean that your evidence isn't being taken on board or anything. We will be taking it seriously and certainly if you'd like to say what you've put down, is that what you're intending to do? You'll read out your statement then. Hello?
Yeah. So hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Your
if
image
you don't
is
mind,
freezing a little bit, unfortunately, but I can certainly hear you, so that's not a problem. So as long as we can hear you, that's fine. Thank you.
okay. I think I'm going to.
Wait.
Sorry, I'm going to stop my video because I explained to Caroline I have poor connectivity. I just wanted you to be able to see me at the beginning to know I'm here. But I'll just use audio for now because it'll probably flow a bit better.
That's not a problem.
I'm happy to go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. That's not a problem. Just go. You can give your statement as you wish. Thank you. So, right, if you'd like to start then, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd just like to point out that I'm obviously speaking as a resident and I will be speaking obviously quite plainly and I just wanted you to hear my views. So there are 4 main points and concerns that I believe should be strongly considered valid reasons as to why this development should not be approved. And these are conservation of green spaces, the suitability of the type of development proposed, issues with traffic on the town and the surrounding areas, and pressure on town infrastructure. So conservation of green spaces is crucial and it's becoming even more important to the well-being of people, wildlife and the environment This has always been the case and has been the general consensus for years, even though it feels at times that the call for preservation of these spaces is largely ignored. If it wasn't before, it has never been more evident than during the pandemic how important green spaces, either for direct use or simply as a surrounding environment, are to human health and well-being. The loss of these spaces is also having a damning effect on wildlife, even if it is not obvious to some. A well-publicised report in the last few years has showed that we have lost nearly half our wildlife since the 1970s, with 41% of species having declined and unbridled urbanisation playing a big part. 26% of the UK's mammals are at risk of becoming extinct, and on a species level, it's even more shocking. Hedgehogs have declined by 95%, turtle doves by 98%, and the common toad by 68%. On top of this, everyone should be very aware by now that we are in a climate crisis, whether some like to believe it or not, and the preservation of these green spaces is needed now more than ever for wildlife conservation, but also for clean air and cooling. I don't need to go on because this is all publicly available information. Safeguarding land for more local, sustainable and wildlife-friendly agriculture is also highly important. We live in a time where the population is expected to increase substantially over the coming years, requiring more food and crops. Even though we can, as small communities, feel unaffected by this issue at times, it is a very real and present problem everywhere. But the solution must be achieved in a sustainable and environmentally friendly way. Part of this will require a shift towards more local agriculture operations away from intensive farming. As a county, we can be quite proud that we already sit within the former, but this can only be sustained if these agricultural spaces are preserved and not continuously bought up and concreted over. As you drive towards Ashford Town now through the back lanes, it's quite shocking to see field after field being swallowed up by horrendous developments with lines of red brick trailing back to the horizon and encroaching more and more into the countryside. All of the above are robust reasons why we should not continue to allow such sprawling developments. We're not talking about a few houses here, we're talking about hundreds. A counter argument is often that we're in dire need of housing. There is not a lack of housing, in my opinion, there is a lack of affordable housing. And while these new developments often claim to offer affordable housing, as the proposed one does at 50%, I can tell you firsthand that what they offer is not so. Affordable housing is arguably needed the most by first-time buyers who are yet to get on the property ladder. I've recently bought my own house and it was an absolute struggle. I've only just got a foot on the ladder at 30 years old. I've not given up just luxuries, I've given up everything that should be part of a healthy, independent adult life for years, so I was able to save the majority of my wages every month. These new developments are, as standard, astronomically out of the price range of those who need affordable housing the most. I had a very hefty deposit that I was able to accrue by living at home while I saved, which is a privilege not everyone has. I was earning over the average wage by the time I came to actually get my mortgage, which a lot of people do not. And I had a perfect credit score, yet I only just scraped through with a mortgage purely because of my sole income. All this to buy a house that, let me tell you, is a complete dump. I'm only able to make it livable because I'm again privileged to have relatives in trade jobs. So you might ask why this is relevant, because it demonstrates that even I, who is arguably in a much better position than my peers, could never afford to buy a house on these newer developments that claim to offer affordable housing. Shared ownership on these houses is also not the saviour it is made out to be, with many ending up in a dire financial situation, paying out through two avenues and also a very real risk of losing hard-earned money. The quality of these large new developments, which often go up quickly and are rushed off to sale rapidly, many before building is even finished, is also well publicised and is frequently demonstrated to be shocking. Snag lists are endless. You can easily find evidence of surveyors called by homeowners on completed developments of these types, finding hundreds of issues per house. These are all additional reasons why these huge sites are not only a blight on the landscape, ours of which is currently considered the jewel of the world, but also simply not suitable for what is needed or for the reasons that they propose. Lastly, it should be obvious to anyone that allowing such a gigantic development of hundreds of houses will put enormous pressure on a small historic town that at times already suffers with traffic volumes, traffic flow, and poor broadband connectivity, both in its own areas and surrounding areas. Many people visit Tenterden. It's a thriving town with huge appeal. But part of that appeal is not only the aesthetic, but the availability of the outdoor spaces and amenities that are not currently overcrowded by an overpopulation in a small area. Adding such gigantic development will, in my opinion, bring with it a vast number of people and vehicles in a very short space of time, putting immense pressure on town infrastructure and arguably damaging the appeal of Tenterden that currently makes it such a thriving and successful town. Okay, thank you, Inspector. I'm finished.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Lozelle. I'm assuming that Mr. White hasn't got any questions. Is that the case? Right. I haven't, but some of those issues will be explored a bit at this inquiry, and so I will be. I mean, the issues of how this will provide affordable housing. And the things about transport, there'll be witnesses on that, and also about various other things to do with biodiversity, ecology. We've dealt with some of the green space issues already on the landscape, and so I'm intending to deal with a lot of those, and some of those certainly are issues that the council used in its reasons for refusal. So thank you very much for coming along, and hopefully they'll be looked at in a reasonable detail. So thank you.
Thank you.
Right, and I've got a hand up from Mr. Poole. Mr. Poole, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yes, if you'll indulge me, sir, I would be very grateful, but I should only be just a few moments.
No, sir, I'm sorry. I don't know why Mr. Poole wants to. You've given your representation.
So, sorry, Mr. Poole, why are you wishing to say something?
Well, I listened to all the discussion about landscape yesterday, and I just was hoping to pick up on a couple of points.
No.
Well, no, sorry, I think that the problem you've got is it's not a hearing. This is a formal inquiry. Okay. So what it is that it's not a way of everyone managing to chip in when they want. If you've got any concerns about anything, you could certainly put an email in, and then I can decide whether it's valid or not, and whether it's something that the appellant might take on board. But there's not. It's not a case that you can just come in and out of the inquiry. Otherwise, it's a formal process, an inquiry. So I'm sorry that you won't be able to add extra points at this stage. You had a chance in your evidence, and like I say, all the written evidence is put forward in advance. So Mr. Howard Williams has now got his hand up.
Well, it was only, sir, just to be sure that if there are objectors or indeed any supporters that wish to ask questions of the appellant's witnesses, they know that they can ask you, sir, for that permission. And I'm not sure that message has got through yet. And I would hate it to be left and then providing a problem later in the day for any reason.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Poole, are these points that have been? I mean, the witness is already gone, but are these points that you wanted to ask the witness, or what?
But basically, there are points that I've listened to the statements made yesterday, and there are obviously I have issues with some of the statements which were made. I'm quite happy to go along with what you suggested, which would be to present you with an email if you're happy to accept that. That would be
well.
fine.
It depends on what evidence is put forward, but okay. You're welcome to make comments on what has been put forward. But if it's new evidence, I can't take it on board at this stage, unless it was evidence that has just recently arrived that's important. So it's just comments on what had been said, is it?
It is basically. It's obviously perhaps where I might disagree with some of the statements which were made, but I'll put those in an email to you, presumably you're happy to look at that and decide whether you think they're important or not.
I think.
So
I think
before you opine, can I say in the strongest terms that I will object? I'm afraid the rules, the way this plays out, as you know, sir, is the appellant has the last right to comment. That is why the procedure expressly allows the LPA, then third parties, then appellants. Now, it is not appropriate for you to get representations post my calling and my witnesses, because it just is an inevitable, it's just not appropriate, frankly. Whether Mr. Paul likes it or not, the way this works is the appellant has the last say in each matter. Frankly, I know with topic-based inquiries that has been changed to a degree, but it's just not appropriate for my witnesses to give evidence and then a third party to submit further representations disagreeing with my witness. It's just not appropriate, frankly. And there's no provision in the rules for that to take place. Because if
I think the problem here is, Mr. Paul, that it is a. I mean, the problem would be it's a formal inquiry, and it's more difficult to actually put in anything to disagree. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of people who might disagree with what's being said, and if it was like that, it would be very difficult to make any progress on the inquiry. But
I perfectly accept what you said. I'm quite happy to leave it at that, honestly. I wasn't trying to create any problems at all. I don't know this process that well, and I was just
no, I can understand that. I think it's a better way is potentially to let the council know what your concerns are, and then they might be able to take them on board at a particular stage. That might be better. Sorry, Mr. Howard-Williams.
So can I make just another suggestion? Because I think to ask independent people to pass on messages or queries to the council might run the risk of placing an unnecessary burden on the authority. It may be matters that have nothing to do with the council's case, for example. But I do think it important that members of the public attending the inquiry recognise that there is the ability, subject to your permission, to ask questions where they've got questions to ask. Where they are not Rule 6 parties, they need your permission to do that, sir. And I just fear that Mr. Poole's position is that maybe he didn't appreciate that he could have asked a question and the time has unfortunately gone. I'm glad that he's content that he can leave it there, but so that we avoid the problem in the future, I think people should understand that if matters aren't covered, that they wish to ask an outstanding question, Mr. White's witnesses are here to do just that, to assist you in your judgment, sir.
I can see that. I think that the danger is that if there's not specific questions that people wanted to ask, it is very awkward at a late stage for someone to just suddenly ask a question of something that's just they don't agree with. I mean, it is, and I can see that there's a balancing act to have, and certainly Mr. Poole's put forward quite a lot of arguments on landscape already. So I don't think. I mean, in terms of your concerns, Mr. Poole, are they really just disagreeing with what's been said? Is that what you're saying? Because there will be an I mean, landscape really and visual impact is something that can be looked at on site. So if there's anything that you disagree with, you can specifically ask for me to look at on the site, on my site visit, if there's something. I don't know whether there's, or are there factual points that you think are wrong? I mean, that's the.
If I can just finalise, really, I'm quite happy to accept, the arrangements for this inquiry. I understand that. I apologise for any
that's all
inconvenience.
right.
Yeah. But the one thing that you said about your site visit, if I identify to you, along with other colleagues or residents, areas we would wish you to look at, perhaps that's the way forward to overcome or
Yes.
deal with my concerns, if you like.
I think
Grateful
that's
for
the
that.
best way, because I'm assuming that you've already put your concerns in writing in your statement and what you read out at the start. So I think that that certainly if there's particular places you'd like me to visit, and if they're mentioned in your evidence that they are ones that of your concern, and if this evidence says I should look at a particular view, then then I'm happy to look at a particular view. So that's as far, if that satisfies what your concerns are about the evidence that's being given, then I'm happy to take that on board. But I think you'll need to coordinate that with the appellant and counsel via the programme officer to actually work out a site visit itinerary, if that's all right.
That's absolutely ideal for me. So I'm very grateful for that offer. And
Right, thank you, Mr. Poole. Thank you for helping me out. And
okay.
like I say, that I prefer not to have too many questions from other people, apart from those issues that the council won't be dealing with. But certainly there is a chance potentially for people to ask questions if they've given evidence at this inquiry. But anyway, thank you very much.
Very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And so what I'll do next is I want to just have an idea of which one we're going to do roundtable first. I'd prefer to get the public right of way out the way first, even if it's a 3 o'clock that this person's. I mean, Mr. White, is Mr. Grady having to go at 3, or is he having to make an appointment at 3? At what time is he available for the inquiry?
He has a very serious medical appointment at 3 o'clock that he needs to attend. So really, he'd like to depart, as I understand it, by about 2 o'clock.
By about 2 o'clock, right?
And of course, with it's not just Mr. Grady. It is, if we don't complete sports this week, we cannot do it next week. We have to.
Yes, I can understand that. And so Mr. Grady's got his hand up anyway. Mr. Grady.
Sorry, if I could just clarify what Mr. White's just said, I can actually stay until 3.
Okay. You can stay until 3.
Yeah.
Right. I think in that case, I'd prefer to do the public right of way first, and then see how we get on. And if it does seem to be a very difficult problem on the public right of way, which I'm be surprised if it is, but if it does, then we might have to chop that off and start the sports. But I'd like to see how we can handle the public rights of way. So what I'll do is I'll adjourn for 15 minutes and then start with the public right of way and see how we go. Right, so the inquiry's adjourned. Thank you.